Following on from some of the really positive feedback that we've received from some of you guys regarding our videos on the writing tasks when it came to the GAT, we thought we'd throw in a short video about how to access the reading parts of the GAT and the multiple choice questions that are there. And I'll say right from the outset that we're only going to focus on one question. We're only going to look at a reading section, and we're not going to purport to be someone who can help you out with maths, science, humanities, and all those other things that I understand that the GAT works through as well. However, I think a lot of you will find this useful because it just is going to take you through some strategies that can help you when it comes to these multiple choice questions and having a little bit of strategy so that you can show the best of yourself when it comes to GAT day. And so we are jumping back to the GAT of 2016 and we're looking at the very first question that they asked. And you'll see that on your screen right now. And you'll notice here that these first three questions are all in regard to the two readings that are put there in front of you. And I'm not going to read them for you word for word. In fact, I'm going to leave the screen like that and I'm going to tell you that you can press pause so that you can read through the first passage. And then I'm going to tell you that we are going to look at the second passage where I will again leave the screen like that so that you can press pause and you can look through it again. And now we're going to head to the questions. And so you'll notice that the way that those two passages are put forward, you'll need to read through them and you'll need to have a really good think about what is really happening there. You'll notice that they have the numbers next to them as well so that the questions can point to various lines that exist within the reading. And we see there with this first question, in lines 1 to 7 of Review 1, the writer suggests Kanye West's performance was unengaging, indescribable, tired and over-rehearsed, irrelevant and characterless. Now, I'll be really honest with you, when it came to answering this myself, I really had to think about it and think, oh my gosh, it could be, maybe 2, even 3 of these answers. And that's okay. The first strategy we're going to talk about in today's video is that sometimes when it comes to the GAT, it's not a case of which one is the right answer. It's a case of which one is the most right. And that might sound a little bit silly to you, but I just want you to think about it in terms of when it comes to reading and reading comprehension, sometimes there is going to be an answer that is definitely the right one, even though 1 or 2 of the other answers may have been somewhat correct. And so the note that you need to take from this is to not rush through. I don't want you just thinking, okay, well, I think it was unengaging and that's what I got when I read it, so I'm not even going to read B, C, or D. I'm going to go with A. Because that way you're going to rush yourself into answers. Occasionally you will find yourself thinking, whilst it could be A, actually now that I've read through them all, I can really see that in fact the most correct answer is C. And so some other strategies that you can use, like any multiple choice test that you may have sat before, are to improve your odds. Look at an answer that you think, well, that one definitely can't be correct. And of course, when it comes to the science and the maths sort of questions, you probably will find that a little bit easier to find the one that is definitely not correct and knock that one out. So all of a sudden now you're looking at a chance out of 1 out of 3 instead of 1 out of 4. Once you've done that, you can start to narrow it down even further and work through that process of elimination. And so in answering this question, we'll jump back up to passage 1. We'll take a look here where it says, okay, so this is clearly what line 1, this is line 5, so down here is 6 and 7. So really this whole first paragraph of the passage that's there. For someone who declared loudly and without any irony that he was the greatest living rock star in the world, Kanye West appeared remote and uncommitted. Now, I know that that's going to be a really key part of the question, a part of the answer, I should say, throughout his heavily publicised set on the stage at Glastonbury at the weekend. He performed under a vast ceiling of very bright lights, which he complained were too low and demanded be raised because he was scared he would hit his head. There was no band on stage and no backup singers, just Kanye along with himself and his ego. So when we jump back down to the question here and we have a think about, okay, what's the answer that I'm going to look at here? I can think to myself, unengaging probably sounds about right when we have those lines about the fact that it said that there was no band on stage, that he demanded that the lights go up, that he declared himself the greatest, rock star in the world when everyone else was probably not thinking that at the time. Indescribable, I could probably knock that one out because there's quite a lot of description in there, and there doesn't seem to be anything to me that when I read that thinks, my gosh, this performance was indescribable because it was so good or so bad. So I'm going to knock out B. Tired and over-rehearsed. Well, I wouldn't say that because the fact that he was asking for the lights to be changed would suggest that it wasn't going to plan. The fact that he was making these outrageous comments, I wouldn't say that that's tired. It definitely wasn't a positive review, but I wouldn't say that it was tired and over-rehearsed and something that the crowd was expecting. But then D says irrelevant and characterless. And I think to myself, well, there's probably some evidence there to maybe suggest that. The idea where it says remote and uncommitted, I am thinking along those lines where there were no band on stage, no backup singers, just him and his ego, remote and uncommitted. So I could look at that and think, does that mean irrelevant and characterless? But at the end of it, I think the most correct answer out of a lot of those would be A, unengaging. And so now we'll take a quick look at question 2 and run it through the same process, just so we can repeat that and that you can have a try as well while you're looking at it thinking, okay, how am I going to come to the answer that I've come to? And it reads, which of the following words would be the best substitute? And so that's a really great way of exploring the point that I made before about sometimes there could be a few answers that could be right, but it's the one that is the best, the most right, as we said before. The best substitute for the word strangeness, as it is used in line 4 of review 2. And so, like all of these things, it's a really good practice in the GAT for you just to be able to take that deep breath and make sure you're following the instructions that are there. Sometimes it is not a case of someone not knowing an answer or not being able to work something out, but rather them getting worried or flabbergasted and getting to a point where they rush through things and don't think through them. So in this one, we've got this really clear, it's in line 4 of review 2. So when we zoom back up here to review number 2, and we can see that this is the 4th line, because it's obviously the one before the 5th. We want them to be otherworldly and distanced from our humdrum existence by their very strangeness. So in context of what it has said before it, where it's talking about rock stars shouldn't be normal, they shouldn't be everyday people, there's no attraction in that. We want them to be distanced from our existence by their very strangeness. We're thinking about, okay, what exactly is meant by that phrase and exactly how can we interpret that? So remember that fact that it says distance from us by their. So distance from us by their charm, well, that could perhaps be correct. That idea that they're different from us, but strangeness, charm doesn't really work. Vulgarity, I don't think there's anything in there that suggests that we want people to be vulgar. Indescribability, okay, maybe the fact that there's some evidence there to suggest that Kanye is a little bit different and a little bit strange, and that this idea of the strangeness is that we can't describe them. But then this last one, unconventionality. And so this idea of if we're thinking about strangeness and in the context in which it's presented there in that passage, the idea is that we go to these concerts to see these people that are far different from us, that are distanced from our humdrum existence. And if we're thinking of this humdrum existence meaning like an everyday conventional way of living, I would say that D would be the answer that would suit best. And so you can see there that it's a case of trying out a few of the answers, thinking about how they would exist within that sentence, thinking about whether it's the best substitution, and again, not necessarily looking at 3 of them and suggesting, well, all those 3 are wrong, so there must be one right answer, but rather being confident that the one that I've picked is by far the most appropriate one. And finally, there's the 3rd question that's asked about those readings, where it asks, now that's the hallmark of a rock star, which comes from line 11 in review 2. Here the writer is being, and we have to choose between polite, sincere, sarcastic, and ambivalent. And so, of course, this is testing our vocabulary to understand all of those terms and what they mean. But on top of that as well, another point that I want to mention, particularly when it comes to the reading questions on the GAT, is the idea that it's when it says to you, you need to go to this line to look at it, you're not expected to only just reread that line. You do need to have that sense of having read the whole passage because the context clues are going to come from that. And so if we jump up to line 11 of review 2, and we suggest that it says, now that's the hallmark of a rock star. Well, if we only read that in isolation, it wouldn't give us much of a clue at all. So if we take a look at what has existed before it about Kanye not caring less about his audience, didn't bother with a false charm, quite a brave performance, there was a petition to ban him from the stage. In the face of all that negativity, he was himself, unpredictable, irritable, self-focused, but in the end, he managed to make the festival all about him. Now, that's the hallmark of a true rock star. And so when we have a think about that and we jump back down to these answers, we have to think, well, is the writer being polite there? There's probably a case to say that they are being polite in that they've looked through all the criticisms of West and then come out and said, well, actually, I thought it was quite good what he did, and actually he was being true to himself. You could say it's polite, but polite would also imply that they're actually hiding something that they really feel about him, whereas it feels like actually they have been a little bit warts and all in their description of what West did at the Glastonbury Festival. When you look at B, sincere, I would suggest that given that this line is coming at the end of all of these criticisms and all the things that existed beforehand to say, well, actually, that's the hallmark of a true rock star, I would say that sincere works really well. And as I'm working through them, sincere is definitely the right answer for me out of the first two, but I'm going to check against the third and the fourth. I don't think she's being sarcastic. And while I could think about the fact that maybe there's a bit of ambivalence towards it in saying, well, it was a bit this, it was a bit that, I would suggest that really this person's being sincere in that they're saying, look, Kanye West may have done all these things, but at the end of the day, he got up, he gave this performance like no one else could give. And in the end, isn't that what a rock star is? I would argue that there is a real sense of sincerity here in the answer. And so therefore, I would suggest that B is the answer, which of course it is. And so in wrapping up, there are so many different things that the GAT tests for you. As we look through them, there are further readings, there are graphs, there are all sorts of mathematical things that you need to look at. And so I've only taken you through the reading, being the English lab, and that's what we are. We've focused a lot on writing, and I wanted to put in a quick video about reading, but there are also some principles from today's video that you can take into the other questions. In that we eliminate the answers that we know that are wrong. Sometimes we need to look for the one that is the most right. But the final thing I want to say to you is to remember that there are so many questions there on the GAT. And you also need to remember that there are so many people sitting the GAT. And the reason that I say this is that, as we've said before, we're working on a ranking and we're working on, something like 70,000 or more students that are going to sit the GAT. And the VCAA need to use that to be able to make a ranking and a distinction between all of those students. You're going to have questions that you don't know the answer to, and that's okay. So when you come to that first question and you think to yourself, I have no idea how anyone would even answer that, know that there are also other students around the state, probably thousands of them, that are thinking the same as you. There are questions where you'll think, oh, well, that was actually quite straightforward and quite simple. I can get that. And there'll be questions there that will really, really challenge you to the point where you might not even have a clue out of what 3 of the answers could be out of the 4. And that's okay. Remember that you are being tested to the point where they need to find out who the absolute top students are in the state. And whilst it's there for you to try your best with and for you to show the absolute best of your ability, don't be discouraged by some of the questions that really challenge you. I know in my experience as a teacher, sometimes I've just jumped into a certain question, pretending to be the expert up there in front of the class that I was preparing the GAT for, and realised quite quickly that I actually wasn't sure whether the answer was B or C or whatever it might have been. There are going to be challenging questions and it is going to be tough sometimes. At the end of the day, you can only do your best, and if you're watching videos like this, it suggests to me that you're already putting in quite a bit of effort. As always, put your questions down in the comments and I'd be happy to get to those and answer them for you. Otherwise, all the best for the GAT and all the best for everything else that's coming up. Good luck.